At 85 years old, Maggie could no longer stay in her cabin due to her children's decision to move her into a nursing home. In that moment, she chose to offer her modest residence to a homeless man who had always helped her. However, her children vehemently opposed this idea. When the homeless man, Denver, finally entered the cabin, he was astonished by what he found inside. Since the death of her husband, Maggie had lived alone in a cabin in Texas for her entire life. She had managed to take care of herself, but at 85, keeping the place clean and well-maintained was becoming increasingly difficult. One day, the phone rang, and it was her eldest son on the other end, insisting once again that it was time for her to move into a nursing home. He spoke of the healthcare professionals who would be there to care for her, the activities to pass the time, and the companionship of others. Maggie listened to all the arguments and finally decided that it might be all right to live in a nursing home. However, she was concerned about what would happen to the homeless man she had wanted to help. They had plans for her cabin and the small piece of land around it, a space she had lovingly tended for almost her entire life. Her eldest son suggested selling the place and using all the money for Maggie. On the other hand, the younger son proposed renovating and renting the property to generate a monthly income for the family. Maggie listened attentively to both proposals, but was convinced she had a better solution. Donating the cabin as it was to Denver, a homeless man from the area who had always been kind to her. Denver had proven to be a good man to Maggie, and she wanted to help him in some way. Her children did not like the idea and did not trust Denver. But considering Maggie's age, they said they would see what was possible. What neither Denver nor her family knew was that Maggie would leave something much more valuable in the cabin than the house itself. Denver was already 60 years old and had lost his wife a decade ago. This pain had led him into a deep depression that greatly affected his life. It was in this dire situation that Denver and Maggie met 3 years ago. Maggie was returning from the market when they crossed paths while she was carrying several bags of groceries. One of the bags broke, and the fruits rolled across the street. Realizing it was an elderly woman, Denver quickly rushed to gather all the fruits and even got another bag for her from a nearby store. After that, Denver asked for permission and took the rest of the bags from the woman, saying, "You can leave it to me. I'll carry everything for you." Denver had no idea that this encounter would change his life forever. From that moment on, he began regularly helping Maggie with her shopping and small repairs around her cabin. Despite Maggie's persistent offers of money, Denver never accepted any payment. He noticed that she lived a simple and solitary life, and he felt immensely grateful every time he received a slice of cake and a cup of coffee made by Maggie's magical hands, as he liked to say. Over the years, these two lonely souls became friends, and Maggie even invited Denver to dinner at her home. They respected each other deeply, and Denver listened attentively to all of Maggie's advice. Maggie observed that Denver's depression symptoms had lessened, and Denver felt useful whenever Maggie needed his help. The day Denver found out Maggie was moving to a nursing home, his heart sank. Maggie explained that for the past 2 years, her children had been constantly calling, insisting that she leave the cabin and the land. She no longer had the strength to deal with the family pressure. "If it were up to me, I would live here until my last day, in the cabin that Harry, my husband, and I built. But in this life, not all our wishes can come true, right?" she said resignedly. Denver hugged his friend and assured her that she could always count on him if she needed help. He thanked her for everything she had done, for giving him the opportunity to regain his dignity and the confidence to try to get out of homelessness. Within 2 weeks, Maggie finally moved to the nursing home. Her family made all the preparations without even consulting her opinion. They wanted everything to be quick and uncomplicated, avoiding debates and confrontations with her. Denver didn't even notice Maggie's move. He just had a feeling that she had already left because he never saw her in town again. Occasionally, he would still pass by the cabin just to make sure everything was in order. During one of these visits, Denver was fortunate enough to find Maggie's children at the cabin. He approached and introduced himself, asking about his friend's whereabouts. The eldest son rudely dismissed him, saying he wouldn't act like his mother. giving money for drinks or financing any other vice the homeless man might have. Denver did not expect such rudeness from the children of a well-mannered woman like Maggie. He stood in silence for a moment, a bit stunned, and asked again where she was. But instead of answering, Maggie's children expelled him from the property, warning him not to return or they would call the police. Denver felt bad but was determined not to let this behavior keep him away from his friend. Since the children did not reveal which nursing home Maggie was in, he was resolved to find out himself. He went to the city's homeless shelter and asked the caretaker if there was a list of nursing homes he could consult. In this way, he discovered that there were only 4 nursing homes in the area, 2 in the city center, 1 in a more distant neighborhood, and the 4th even farther on the outskirts of the city. But that did not matter to Denver. He was willing to walk as far as necessary to find Maggie. He bathed at the shelter and set out early the next day. The first 2 nursing homes were near the shelter, but Maggie was not in either of them. He walked for another 40 minutes to reach the 3rd home, where there was a Margaret, but it was not his Maggie. So, Denver continued walking for another hour until he reached the main road leading to the last nursing home on his list. He kept walking, asking for rides along the way, but no one stopped to help him. About 3 hours later, he finally spotted the nursing home and headed towards it, very tired and thirsty, as he was no longer a young man. Entering the place, Denver thought it was now or never. She could only be there. At the reception, he didn't even ask if there was a Margaret there. Confidently, he said he wanted to visit Margaret, who had moved in a few days ago. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, but then confirmed that yes, Margaret was there. Denver then asked to see her, claiming to be her brother, knowing that merely being a friend might not suffice for the institution to allow the visit. They warned him that visiting hours were almost over, but he could see her briefly. They led him to her room, and he was left speechless at what he saw. His friend was lying down and looked ill. He had never seen her so fragile. However, when she noticed his presence, her face lit up with a smile, and despite her weakened state, she tried to sit up and greet him. Maggie realized it was Denver at the door. Her eyes lit up, and she gave him a genuine smile. Denver approached slowly, still assessing Maggie's condition, but the elderly woman was in a hurry. She gestured for him to come closer and said, "Don't waste time. I have something to tell you." Denver sat beside her and helped her get comfortable. She leaned towards him and whispered something in his ear that sent shivers down his spine. "Is this serious?" "Really?" he asked, completely incredulous about what he had just heard. Maggie patted his cheek, then squeezed his hand and said, "Yes, it's serious. It's yours, and everything inside it is for you too." After a while, a staff member at the nursing home informed them that visiting hours were over and Denver had to leave. He didn't know exactly what to think about what Maggie had said, but he felt a bit sad seeing her in such a fragile state. She no longer seemed like the same independent and determined old lady he had known. Maybe the change was too recent, and she hadn't gotten used to it yet. As he left, he glanced over his shoulder and saw Maggie smiling. He didn't know it then, but that would be the last time he would see his friend. The next morning, Denver gathered the last of his coins and bought a modest floral arrangement. He made the long journey back to the nursing home. Upon arrival, he discovered that his friend had passed away that night. He wasn't prepared for the news and struggled to process it. He cried there, and the receptionist asked if he hadn't been informed by his brother since the family had been notified during the early hours. Denver didn't respond. He just stepped aside, letting his tears wash over his face. Denver returned to the cabin, which was now his according to Maggie's last words. However, he didn't feel happy. A copy of the key was hidden in the same place Maggie had indicated, so he had no trouble entering. He wanted to be joyful about the gift, but he couldn't stop thinking about Maggie. At that moment, the house felt like a hollow, empty space. He decided to make coffee the same way Maggie used to make it for him. He opened the highest cupboard in the kitchen, searching for the coffee grounds. In front of the coffee, he found a cardboard box. As he tried to take it out, the box fell to the floor with a considerable thud. When he picked it up, He realized it was heavy and, out of curiosity, decided to open it to make sure he hadn't damaged anything of Maggie's. What he saw inside the box left Denver utterly speechless. Completely breathless, Denver stared at the stacks of money before him. It was an amount he had only ever seen in movie scenes. He placed everything on the table and stood there for several minutes, contemplating the significance of it all. There were over 40 stacks of $10,000 each, totaling nearly $500,000, a small fortune. Denver deduced that these were Maggie's life savings. He recalled Maggie confirming that the cabin was his, along with everything inside it. Despite this, he hesitated, but eventually gathered all the bundles into an old, worn leather bag and headed towards the door. He knew exactly what he needed to do. In the days that followed, Denver made modest renovations to the cabin, just enough to make it more appealing without removing the original features cherished by Maggie and her husband. He selected Maggie's personal belongings and arranged them as if the space were a museum exhibit. On the living room wall, he hung a beautiful photo of Maggie and placed a lit candle right beneath it. Denver wasn't doing this for the property or the money he found. He wanted to honor the friendship he had with Maggie. It didn't take long for Maggie's two sons to arrive at the cabin and find Denver living there. They questioned what he thought he was doing, and Denver responded honestly. He told them that he had visited Maggie in the nursing home before her death and that she had left the cabin and everything inside to him. The sons thought Denver, besides being homeless, had mental issues. How could they believe that such a valuable property, which had belonged to their parents, was simply given to a homeless man they didn't even know? Denver regretted that they didn't believe his story but insisted it was true. He also regretted that Maggie's sons were unaware of their mother's last wishes. Hearing this, Maggie's younger son became enraged and was about to attack Denver. He only stopped because his older brother intervened, saying that if they laid hands on him, they would lose their composure and face legal consequences. The older brother suggested resolving the situation in the most civilized way possible by calling the police. And so they did. Within 20 minutes, a police vehicle arrived with 2 officers. After learning about the situation, the officers informed Denver that he needed to present some form of documentation to support his version of events. It could be a digital recording, a will, or a signed letter from Maggie. However, Denver had nothing but Maggie's word. The officers then told him that he needed to vacate the premises immediately. Denver tried to argue, stating that even if he left the residence, he had no other place to go. Denver, still feeling deeply wounded by the entire situation, explained that even if he left, he would have technically invaded the property, which wouldn't go unpunished. He wanted to file a complaint and hoped to resolve the matter once and for all. Denver was heartbroken by how Maggie's sons disregarded their mother's last wishes. He couldn't hold back his tears and asked for a few moments to gather his personal belongings. Noticing that the cabin was in better condition than before, the older son granted the homeless man a few extra minutes. Denver took his old blanket and placed it inside the ancient, faded leather suitcase, covering what was already inside. Before leaving, he cast one last look at the sanctuary he had created for his dear friend Maggie and surrendered to the authorities without causing further trouble. He didn't want to give Maggie's sons any more reasons to harm him or worsen his situation. Despite the odds being stacked against him, Denver was not naive. He knew that Maggie's sons had no idea what was about to unfold in the coming weeks. The younger son did not drop the charges, and upon arriving at the police station, Denver narrowly avoided arrest because he had no prior criminal record. However, he was instructed to quickly find a public defender to represent him in the proceedings. Once released, Denver went to the shelter where he spent his nights and spoke with the manager, asking for a recommendation for a law firm. The manager simply pointed to an advertisement in the city service book. Maggie's sons wasted no time and imposed a restraining order against Denver, preventing him from approaching the cabin, which they promptly put up for sale at $84,000. They didn't bother removing the furniture, decorations, or personal belongings, prioritizing the sale of the property above all else. A week later, a lawyer named Charles Winter contacted Maggie's sons. He expressed interest in the property and inquired if it could be used as a summer home. The sons didn't object to the idea, but explained that there were other interested buyers and that the property would go to the highest bidder. Charles then asked about the highest offer they had received so far. The older son revealed that a potential buyer had offered $90,000, payable in 3 installments. Charles remained silent on the other end of the line for a moment, as if calculating or considering whether it was worth participating in this auction. When he resumed the conversation with Maggie's sons, he proposed $91,000 in cash, with the condition that the deal be closed as soon as they hung up the phone. The 2 sons didn't need much time to think before accepting the offer. They agreed and scheduled the finalization of the deal for 7 days later, when the exchange of money for the property keys would take place. The 2 sons celebrated the sale and announced that they would use the time to clear out all the belongings left by the former occupant of the cabin. However, Charles explained that it wasn't necessary to do so. If their intention was to get rid of the items in the cabin, he was willing to pay an additional $1,000 to leave everything as it was. Ambitiously, Maggie's sons agreed to close the deal for $92,000 and not remove anything from the place. 7 days after the phone negotiation, Maggie's 2 sons went to the cabin to finalize the sale of their parents' home. A luxury sedan pulled up with 2 occupants. The driver, a man in his 40s or 50s wearing a suit, got out and immediately introduced himself as the lawyer Charles Winter. The passenger remained in the vehicle. After exchanging pleasantries, Charles and Maggie's sons began the transaction. The lawyer opened his briefcase, revealing several bundles of money. He handed the briefcase to the younger brother, who checked the money and gave a positive nod to the elder brother. Then, Charles handed over an envelope with documents and the key to the property. "Congratulations, Charles. This is your new summer home," the elder brother said. However, Charles extended his hand and said, "Don't congratulate me, gentlemen. The true owner of this charming cabin isn't me." Maggie's sons looked at each other, puzzled and unsure of what was happening. "I'm just the intermediary," Charles continued. At that moment, the second occupant of the luxury sedan stepped out of the car. He was also dressed in a suit, with a well-groomed beard and hair, and shiny, immaculate shoes. Maggie's sons felt they recognized him from somewhere but weren't completely sure. When the man stood right in front of them, they realized it was Denver, the homeless man. "He's the one buying the property. All the money in the briefcase is his. Please complete the handover of the keys and documents to him," Charles said. Maggie's sons were stunned, unsure whether to feel deceived or humiliated. But the money was there, and it was the agreed amount. The elder son saw no alternative but to hand over the key and the envelope, albeit with a look of deep anger. Denver accepted them, passed the envelope to Charles, and kept the key. "You never knew your mother's true wishes," he said. "You did everything to keep me away from her and what remained of her. But it seems she knew her sons well and left the necessary conditions to ensure her will was carried out." Except for the lawyer, no one understood what was happening or how this homeless man had obtained the money. They only knew they were receiving part of their own mother's inheritance. Now Denver could live in the cabin legally. "I will inhabit this cabin and honor everything Maggie and her husband built. See you in court. Use this money to hire a good lawyer for the lawsuit you filed against me. You'll need it," Denver said. "Now leave my property, or I'll have to call the police," he added. With these words, Denver turned away from Maggie's sons and closed the cabin door behind him. He lit the candle beneath Maggie's photo, and that night, he had a peaceful and restorative sleep in his new home.